We're very honored to have Rabbi Adlerstein with us. I asked Rabbi Adlerstein to send me his bio so we can put it together with the flyer that goes out. And I didn't quite know what we were getting ourselves into and how fortunate we really are that he's giving us the opportunity to learn from him tonight. Just a very short idea when I saw what was on Rabbi Adlerstein's bio as the director of interfaith at Simon Wiesenthal Center. Now, this week's parsha has the psukim that we say in the Seder night every single year. It's a summary as if of what happened to Klal Yisrael in Mitzrayim. And the Haggadah says, "Tzei ulemeid ma bikesh Lavan ha'arami lasos liYaakov Avinu." Go and learn what it was that Lavan wanted to do against Yaakov Avinu. And it says that Lavan wanted to uproot the entirety of Yaakov Avinu, whereas Paro only wanted to uproot the males. And what's interesting to note is if you look in the psukim about Paro, Golus Mitzrayim, the psukim are extensive exactly how Paro had this agenda to completely wipe out Klal Yisrael. When you learn the psukim about what Lavan wanted to do to Yaakov, it's very concise. You wouldn't pick up on this, that he wanted to uproot everything, and certainly that he wasn't more severe in his agenda against against Yaakov Avinu. But I think the lesson is very clear, is that when you want to understand what's going on in the Torah, you need Chazal and the Chachamim to open up your eyes to understand, to read the map, exactly what's in front of us. That sometimes superficially it might look that one enemy or one nation wants to do more harm against the Jewish people than another nation, but you need the Torah to open up your eyes to show it actually Lavan wanted to uproot in the entirety of Yaakov Avinu, but on the other hand, you have Paro that only wanted to uproot the males. And I think with Rabbi Adlerstein and his background, the background of his relevance and ability to interpret modern events, but with the depth and the perception of Chazal and his Torah knowledge, we have the unique opportunity of hearing from him this evening. Rabbi Adlerstein.
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi Markovitz. I have no idea what you were talking about, but it sounded good. Good evening, everyone. So this is what a real shul in Eretz Yisrael looks like, rather than a prayer drop-in center. Wow, this brings back memories. They tell a story about the old country, about a Magid. In Europe, rabbis only spoke twice a year, once before Pesach, once before Yom Kippur. But there were people who were sort of like circuit riding rabbis. They used to pull into town. There's one of them right there. A Gilgal, obviously. And people found speakers entertaining back then. They would speak for a good number of hours. They'd come back for Shachar Sunday morning and they'd collect donations. That's how they supported themselves. So one fellow writes to the Rav long in advance of his planned visit, secures permission from the Rav, and he comes to town. And Friday night, he shows up, and like two people show up. Shabbos morning after Musaf, 3 people show up. Very disappointed. He goes to the Rav and he says, "I don't understand what happened. I spoke to you so far in advance. Didn't you get the word out that I was coming?" He said, "Yeah, but a few of them showed up anyway." So I'm grateful to you for showing up. Let me tell you a nightmare scenario of mine, not only mine but other people as well. One of the things I was doing in Los Angeles for the very close to 4 decades that I lived there there's a certain amount of kiruv. People from all walks of life. Sometimes they were even Jewish. He used to he used to come to us for Shabbos, and anyway, I pushed kiruv to my talmidim. But imagine the following: you you get somebody inspired that they finally are willing to reach out to their coworkers. Coworkers are not from, and it's an art. It's an art how to be able to invite people into your practice, into your house for Shabbos, without offending them. So one guy works on a coworker, very bright, Ivy Leagues, when Ivy Leagues still meant something. And he turns him down for months and months. Finally, he agrees to come for Shabbos. He comes with his wife, and it happens to be the Shabbos before Purim. So, one of the things that you like showing off is the interaction between generations. Sometimes two, sometimes three, sometimes four at the Shabbos table. But particularly the enthusiasm of the children as they answer the Parsha questions, right? The Parsha questions are sheets that a school sends home every week that the kids rehearse the answers to for 6 days, so that when the parents ask them the questions, they always know the right answers, and the parents feel that the $35,000 that they spent on tuition was well worth it. Being the week before Purim, the Parsha questions center around Purim. So, you get through a couple of them, and then you get to one, and the words are scarcely out of your mouth when you realize, uh-oh, I shouldn't have asked this one. The question is, so when Achashverosh asked Vashti to appear before everyone at the Suda, why didn't she come? And 4 hands go up, and they all yell at once, because she grew a tail. And then you knew you lost this couple. They knew not too much, but they heard of the book of Esther and the story about the Jewish heroine who saved her people. And it seems like a perfectly reasonable story. And now you have her growing a tail? Oy, how are you going to recover from that? So my question to you is, how are you guys going to recover from that? What do you make of it? And what do you make of hundreds of other similar examples in the Safrut, the literature of Chazal? About 1/3 of the Talmud. 1/3 of the Talmud is what we call Agadah. 2/3 halacha, 1/3 Agadah. Agadah is essentially everything that's not halachic. Sometimes it's history, sometimes it's ethics, sometimes it's philosophy, but it's everything that's not purely halacha. And some of the stories can get quite fantastical. I recall as a late teenager, I can say I almost left Yiddishkeit because I was kind of a skeptic to begin with. And when I heard certain midrashim, including the one that really ticked me off was that Og Melech HaBashan. Remember Og in Chumash Bamidbar? There's a medrash that Og Melech HaBashan was so tall he used to fry his eggs on the sun. So that just did not sit well with me. I felt that if I'm supposed to believe that, then I can't believe anything in this Torah. So Agadah is not just that 1/3 of the Talmud, it also includes many different midrashic works. The most famous, of course, are Medrash Rabbah, Medrash Tanchuma, but there are many, many works of midrash that we would call Agadah. Why is it important for us to figure out what all of this is about, particularly the stories that sound so far beyond belief? As usual, you can take any question and break it down to Sur Meirah, and asay tov. The things that that we want to avoid, the negatives we want to avoid, and appreciating the positive. Historically, what are some of the negatives? Well, back in the old days, medieval church used to take some of these passages from the Agadah, and boy, did they use them against us. Now, if you've ever seen the movie, I think the BBC, Yamach Shemo, did one on the disputation, I think it was called, the Ramban's debate in front of the King of Spain, of Aragon, really. And the other tried to prove that you know who, Jesus was the real Messiah, because there's a medrash that Mashiach was born when? At the time of the Churban. And who else was born around the time of the Churban, even though it was 35 years later, other than our guy? So he must be the real guy. But it gets worse than that. Modern anti-Semites were not far behind the medieval church, and they're still with it. If you have a very, very strong stomach, and I'm really not recommending this to you, and you wade through the innumerable cesspools of professionally produced anti-Semitism, you're going to see plenty of citations from the Agadah. In the famed Bayless trial, that wasn't the worst, but the Bayless trial tried to prove that, Bayless, of course, was guilty of this blood libel thing, because the Talmud says in the Agadah that Atem Kruyim Adam, you Jews are called Adam, are called people, but non-Jews are not called people. And this claim still resounds today by more people than we can count. And there's so many examples of that. And then lastly, you have just us. Forget about all the outside influences. What do you make of stories that don't make any sense, that sound, frankly, ridiculous? Is this a Daf Yomi community? You have people... Exactly. The single collection of the strangest passages of Agadah in all of Shas are in Hamocher Asasfina, Rabba Babarchana. Right? 21 stories. And some of them are doozies. The Mishnah says in Avos, Da Masha Toshev Lapi Karis. You have to become learned enough that you know how to respond to the scoffer, to the heretic. The Alter of Slobodka used to say, Velcha Apikaris? Which Apikaris? And point to himself. You have to know how to answer some of these questions for yourself. And if you tell yourself, okay, I'm just going to ignore it out of faith alone, it's not a terrible reaction, but sometimes the stuff builds up within you. So much for the Sur Meira. On the positive side, you have the issue of chinuch, of how to bring up children. Now, I'll give you an example. You have a passage in the Agadah that Moshe Rabbeinu was, how tall? It's actually in the Gemara. 10 amos. Imagine him trying to walk into a suit store and getting, he couldn't take anything off the rack. 10 amos is pretty tall, right? 15 to 20 feet. Now, if you as a... Was this? I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's one of the items on the list that we're going to talk about Paro being like that. But it gets worse. You're forgetting the rest of the Gemara. And Mo'og Melech HaBashan was bigger, and Moshe had to jump up just to get to his ankles. Right. So you have a choice as a parent, as a grandparent. You're learning with your kids, and you want to spare them some of the agony you had facing up to all of these stories. So you kind of skip them, or you say, the rabbis exaggerated. It was only there for entertainment or whatever. And there are people who do that. There are schools that do that. And there's schools that deliberately just don't mention midrashic elements at all. We're into pshat and pshat alone. It has certain advantages, but it has disadvantages as well. The first one to point them out is the Rambam. Rambam himself, the rationalist par excellence, who writes in the Hagdama in his introduction to Pirush HaMishnayos that when you teach children, one of the reasons, let me start the sentence over again. One of the reasons why Chazal, why our sages often couched their lessons in such strange terms and with such strange stories is to make a necessary impression upon children. A child who is spared the fantasy stories, he may have heard about Moshe being 10 amos, but he doesn't regard Moshe as a larger-than-life friend. The child who receives the more traditional chinuch, Moshe, 10 amos tall, imagine him on the basketball court. He knows that Moshe was 10 amos tall, that he killed the Mitzri, he killed the Egyptian with the Shem HaMefarish, never had to use his AK-47, that he was born mohul, he was born circumcised as a sign of his perfection, and that he was shokul keneged his holdor, he was the equal of everybody in his generation. So you say, but isn't such an approach like literalist and naive? Yes and no. It's a great way to introduce kids to who Moshe Rabbeinu was. When they're older, they can learn, yes, Moshe was indeed 10 amos tall, but not measured by a yardstick. He was 10 amos tall and being a larger-than-life figure. And when they get older, they'll learn the right shot. So children grow up. The problem is that sometimes their understanding doesn't, and people are mired for life with the understanding they had when they were 7 years old. That doesn't always work. What's the Rambam's prescription? Anyone who wants to start serious work on the Agadah has to start with the Rambam's comments in Pirush HaMishnayos, in the commentary to Mishnah before the last parak of Sanhedrin. He talks about 3 groups in his day and their attitude towards Agadah, especially Agadah that makes no sense. He said one group says they look at some of these passages and they say, that's ridiculous, and close the book and move on. And he says, who follows that shita? He says, usually stuffed up intellectuals, which in his day were, what did they do for a living? Physicians. Right? Physicians knew it all. Physicians, first of all, you didn't start medical school without doing philosophy. Galen himself said philosophy is so important, you can't be a good doctor without doing philosophy. So they were the elitists. He said, okay, that's the first group. We don't agree with the first group. There's a second group that says, oh, wow, golly gee, Oak Melech HaBashan used to fry his eggs on the sun. Wow, I'm going to shout it from the rooftops. And they do. And they go through life and from place to place saying, Oak Melech HaBashan, you know how big he was? He used to fry his eggs on the sun. And the Rambam says, they think they're doing HaKadosh Baruch Hu a favor, because even though their credulity has been tested and strained, but they say, if it's Torah, I believe it. and I will do away with my rationality and accept it, because if it's Torah, I'm going to believe it. The Rambam says about those people, remember there's a pasuk at the beginning of Devarim, towards the beginning of Devarim, that the non-Jews will say, Rak am chacham v'navon hagoy hagadol hazeh. What a wise and discerning people is this great nation. The Rambam says these literalists who think they're doing HaKadosh Baruch Hu a favor, instead elicit the response of the onlooker as Rak am sachol v'navol hagoy hakaton hazeh. What a foolish and small people this is for the kind of stuff they believe. Then there's a third group, which he says, unfortunately, that's the smallest of the three. And the third group says, this sounds pretty strange, but I know who the authors are of this. These are the same people that wrote the Gemara that I just spent 6 weeks with my chavruso learning 3 lines, because there's so much depth there. Could the people who wrote with so much depth write with so much non-depth? Silliness? Can't be. I must be missing something. And I'm going to keep on trying until I figure out what the key is to unlocking this passage. That's the right approach. Implicit in that, and there are ways of showing it in other places as well, particularly in the Hagdamah to Moreh Nevuchim, that the Rambam believed that the proper way of approaching many passages was as a non-literalist, to see things in symbolic or allegorical terms, to see everything in allegorical terms and never take any Maimer Chazal literally can be problematic. And unfortunately, I don't have a recipe for telling you when to do not. I am, however, a fan of the person who I think is the greatest expositor of the Agada that we ever had and probably ever will. And that's the Maharal of Prague, who lived in the late 17th century and really the first decade of the, the end of the 16th century and first decade of the 17th century. Many of you probably know him through the famous Golem story, right? You go to Prague today, and what you'll see in any gift shop is a figurine of the famous robot that the Maharal created using Kabbalah that protected the Jews of Prague in his day. Is it true? Is it not true? We're not going to go into that right now. I have evidence that the Golem actually really existed, because I taught in a high school for a good number of years, and I'm convinced that many of my students were direct descendants of the Golem. The Maharal bridged worlds, particularly the worlds of philosophy, science, and Kabbalah. Everything that he did, however, all of his accomplishment always was based on Chazal. Even though he wrote books topically, which didn't happen for hundreds of years after him, everything was introduced with a Maimer Chazal, a passage from Chazal, and some explication thereof. He drives home his unflinching conviction in the depth of thought of Chazal and of the Masorah. He uses allegory, non-literalism, heavily, but not because he's averse. You know, one of the famous stories, and now we get into the part which I really like, which is actually taking passages from the Agada and giving you his explanation. Gemara in Shabbos, about a person, very, very poor person, Nebuch, his wife died in childbirth, leaving him with a baby. He had no money, couldn't hire a wet nurse, and the baby was going to starve. So what happened? Kadosh Baruch Hu created a nest, and he was able to nurse the child. And Machlokas Abaye Varava asked me afterwards about the famous story about Chasidim and Misnagdim that's based on this mimer, but he was able to nurse the child. The Maral says, actually, I think what Chazal meant is not that he physically developed the ability to breastfeed, but what it means is that he was basically a guy with not too much education, not too much training, and no way of making a living. And one day he just, walks out and he's standing in front of a Fortune 500 building. Out comes the CEO, sees the guy, and he says, young man, you doing anything? I really need some help. And he pulls him in, and next thing you know, the guy's a VP, pulling in a big salary, and he's able to support his child. But then he adds, I explain it this way because I believe that that's the way Chazal really speak most of the time. But it could very well be that what Chazal mean is that literally HaKadosh Baruch Hu did a nes, reversed the course of nature, because yes, HaKadosh Baruch Hu does that. And he continues to do that in every generation. The morale was underappreciated in his time. He was sort of like dormant, like Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto was for a while, and then really took off. Hasidim put him on the map, and then in the non-Hasidic world, it was Rav Hutner, Zichron Levracha, who really took the morale and propelled him into high orbit over the Litvish world. So I'm going to give you a couple of selections from morale, including one or two that have to do with Rosh Hashanah and the like, and hope to whet your appetite for more. Let's start with the way I started, Vashti's tale. Vashti's tale. What does Vashti's tale mean? Now, the problem with this Agada, and the reason why the morale here doesn't say HaKadosh Baruch Hu did a nace and she grew a tail, is because everything about Megillas Esther is about the non-miraculous, or rather, about all the miracles being hidden from the eye. Not the Cecil B. DeMille kind of miracle, but miracles nonetheless. HaKadosh Baruch Hu's intervention in making sure that things turned out the way he wanted them to. So he says, let's say you woke up one morning, and it was a Shabbos morning, to boot. You get out of bed, and you feel something dragging behind you, and you see a 6-foot tail that has sprouted from behind. What do you do with it? You can't call your physician. You can't call the local news station, and you really want to go to shul. So what do? You hide it. You kind of coil it up and find your loosest pants or skirt, and you carry it around. Now, in the afternoon when you want to experiment, can you use it to try to grab bananas off a tree? You're not going to pull it down on Shabbos, of course, but you could even try. It's not going to work. You're not a monkey. What good does a tail do you? A tail is something that just doesn't belong on a human being. It's a useless appendage. It is what we sometimes call dead weight, or at least the Americans call it spare tire. Can you imagine Martians coming down and reading through some of our literature and finding out that there were people who believed that they walked around with spare tires? We know what spare tire means. It means you got stuff around the middle that you're not using too well, and it doesn't really belong there. Says the morale. What was Vashti's tale? She ate too much. Somebody, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, of course, arranged it. that somebody sent her 5-pound box of her favorite chocolates. And I can't believe I ate just one. She didn't. She ate up the whole thing. That morning, she gets on the scale and says, oh no. She feels bloated, heavy, and says, this is not a day to make an appearance before the country on camera. That was her tale. Does that fit in with the Purim story? Sure it does. And the problem. You mentioned before Paro. You'll have to excuse me for being sort of graphic, but there is a rather graphic depiction of Paro in the Gemara. He was 1 amma tall. His beard was 1 amma in length, and one other part of his anatomy, which I will not spell out, common mostly to men, unless they identify differently, was also 1 amma. Strange looking critter, right? Maral says, what do we make of this? Maral lays down a principle which is one of the most important to carry you through Agada, throughout Shas, and throughout Midrashim. You remember just this one comment of Maral, and you're in better shape than when you walked in. Maral says that Chazal often talk about things, about people, about places, not as they appear in what we consider reality, but according to their true nature. If the inner nature of Paro were allowed to display itself, would transfigure itself into something physical, what would Paro look like? And the Gemara says 3 things. One is that with all his power, he was really a much, much less than a midget. His stature was no real stature. Now, in reality, how tall was Paro? How tall was Moshe Rabbeinu? Both of them may have had the same suit size. In Paro's case, if that inner reality could display itself, he would be that tall. In addition, his hirsute nature, how he liked to portray himself. Remember, grooming, the beard in particular, especially in old times, was a statement of who you were. That was the real show of male masculinity. His beard was as tall, would have been as tall as he was. There was much more show than substance. Sounds like a presidential candidate I can think of. And then, lastly, the part that we're not going to go into in particular, but that is a statement of what he was. He was taiva. He was so much into taiva that the way it would have displayed itself is fill in the rest. Okay, let's get closer to the Yom Hadin, since we're getting closer to the Yemei Hadin. We're going to be standing before HaKadosh Baruch Hu in a couple of weeks. HaKadosh Baruch Hu will judge us as he does everyone and everything, and even the Malachim and Shemayim. And we're mispalo. We started already Rosh Chodesh Elul, to daven in earnest, to get serious. There's a place in the Gemara that talks about the ultimate judgment day. And the description of that, I think, can help us understand what we should be thinking of as we get closer to Rosh Hashanah. The Gemara says, what happens when a person stands before HaKadosh Baruch Hu on his own ultimate personal judgment day? B'shah shemachnisin adam ledin. the time that they bring a person for his final accounting after his death, standing before HaKadosh Baruch Hu, what do they ask of a person? So, I don't know. If I were writing the movie, I guess I'd start with name, rank, serial number. Or, okay, buddy, you want into heaven? Let's see what you did with your life. You're Jewish, huh? Good, that's a good start. How you were into the big ones, right? You kept Shabbos perfectly every week, right? Shabbos, Kashrus, Taras Mishpacha. None of those are the questions that the Gemara sets forth. The Gemara gives 6 questions. I'm only going to mention 3, maybe 4. What's the first question that I ask you? That's the first one. The first one is Nasata v'Nasata b'Yamun. Okay. Gemara and Shabbat, the girsa we have is that the first question is, okay, how honest were you in your business dealings? Business dealings? I was a computer engineer. What do you mean? Why is that the first question? Second question, Kavati itum l'Torah. Kavati itum l'Torah. Did you set time aside for learning Torah? That doesn't sound like the most intelligent question. The question, like if I were God, I'd be asking, so how many blot did you finish? And of those blot, how many do you remember? Uh-oh. Next question. Tzipisa li Yeshua. Did you long for redemption? Did you long for Mashiach? Again, it's a little off. It's the wrong question. It should be, I created this world to have a definite ending. It leads up to Mashiach. What was your contribution? Did you bring Mashiach closer? How did you bring him closer? Would you just sit back in the bleachers? But that's not the question. Did you long for redemption? Yeah, I long for redemption. I never did a darn thing to make it happen. Oh, you passed. What do these questions mean? Morale says that unlike what we may think, the opening questions that they ask you are not meant to trip you up. They're not meant to catch you. They're not meant to embarrass you about how badly you blew it. They are meant for you to self-define. And basically, it's a binary question. A binary question. They ask you, remember the story in Bereshis about how HaKadosh Baruch Hu created man? Right? Well, it was done in 2 stages. First, he took from all of the soil and molded Adam into a humanoid, and then he breathed into him Nishmas Chaim. He gave him a neshama. He breathed into man something from himself. He breathed of the essence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu into man. It's one of the themes about Tekiyah Shofar. It recalls the creation of man, because just as we inject our breath into the shofar, we recall how HaKadosh Baruch Hu injected his breath into us. What does this story boil down to? Says the morale. Every person has 2 components, the physical and the angelic. Which one did you identify with? That's the question. 6 different examples of it. It's all one question. What did you identify with? First one, Nasasa v'Nasata b'Yamuna. Did you deal honestly in your dealings? Imagine the following scenario. It's after Yom Kippur, and the HaKadosh Baruch Hu has made his great gezeros, and you got 2 malachim who are supposed to now do their magic in the coming year. One of them is supposed to pull up Dow Jones 3,000 points. And another one is to keep interest rates down. These are what the two malachim are charged with. Lots of malachim. And they all have, like one task. So the two malachim are standing there at the heavenly bus stop, and they're waiting. And one malach says to the other malach, I can't believe it. I left my wallet home. I can't get on the bus. Could you lend me a couple of bucks so I can get on the bus? Malach says, yeah, sure. We'll meet back here in a couple of months. You'll pay me back then. It's a ridiculous scenario. Get past the idea that malachim don't take buses. What's really wrong with it? What's really wrong with it is malachim are self-contained. Whatever HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants them to do, they can do. They don't have to borrow from anybody. They don't have to take from anybody. In life, you can't be just a giver and not a taker. As a human being, you have to breathe, you have to eat, you have to interact with people. But says the morale, the point of this Gemara is that they ask you, did you at least try to keep the angelic alive within you so that you only took from this world those things which absolutely belong to you without crossing lines? When you cross the line, you're saying that you identify more as a physical being than as an angelic being. Next, did you set time for learning? Again, they don't ask you how many blocks you learned or how much you remember, how well you applied yourself. It was, hey, did you regularly forget to eat supper? No, I can't say that. My stomach wouldn't let me. Did you realize that as a spiritual being, you also have daily spiritual needs? Did you at least set time? I'm not going to ask you what was on the menu, but did you recognize that as a spiritual being in part, you at least owed it to put in your schedule something to feed the spiritual side of yourself? The third one, Sipisel Yeshua. Did you long for redemption? Essentially, Morale says, it's could you open up the New York Times without getting physically sick? Everybody here is young enough to remember what newscasts were like even decades ago. There's a horrible murder in 5 miles from here, and some guy went berserk and he killed his wife, his mother-in-law, 3 of his children, and worse yet, he even got the dog. And now we go on to the sports scores. The instant moving from the real stuff to the trivial. It's not a pretty world. It never was a pretty world. Can you read the paper in the morning without saying, "Oh, this is not the way HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants the world to be"? I long for the time in which V'haya Hashem lemelach al kol haaretz, and people will be able to live as individuals, as families, as societies, the way HaKadosh Baruch Hu set it up. So all these, and he does the same with the next 3 questions, which we don't have time for right now, but he shows how they are all variations of this theme. Self-defining. What am I? Do I at least acknowledge, encourage, and try to make my spiritual side thrive? That's a great question to ask in Chodesh Elul as we prepare. One last example. Medrash Rabbah, talking about Yaakov and his description as we first meet him. Esav was what? He was ruddy and hairy. And Yaakov was ish chalak. Chalak, it doesn't mean he was chalak kosher when you shechted him. Chalak, he was smooth skinned, not hairy. Why is that so important? Medrash says, marshal to two people, one guy with a haircut like Howard Stern, and another guy who's totally bald. And they're standing in animated conversation downwind from a huge smokestack in old Youngstown, Ohio. And they're there for hours, engrossed in their conversation. When they leave and they look at each other, they look at themselves in the mirror, what do they see? They're both covered with soot. Who has the easier time cleaning up? The bald guy. That's it. And it's gone. The guy with the big afro, he's going to be working on that hair for a while. It doesn't come out so easily. Says the Medrash that is Klal Yisrael, and that's Esav. And that's our chatoyim. Those are our sins. There are sins that can be wiped away easily, and that there are sins that stick to us. The stickiness of Averos is the theme of the avoda of Yom Kippur. Explains the Maral. There are two goats with two messages. What do you do with one goat? The Soyer HaMishtaleach, you send it away. What does that mean? It doesn't mean, as some people thought, that some people still think. The Mishnah says there were people in its time who also made that mistake. They think that the Kohen Gadol literally takes the chatoim and puts it on the goat and sends it away, and the people were so angry at this goat, they pulled at its hair. He says the sending away of the sa'ir, of that goat, was the recognition that if we want to, we can be the ish chalak, that it is part of the nature of the Jewish neshama to be able to rid ourselves of Aveira just for the asking. If we're really serious about it, we can disengage, we can repudiate the Aveiros. Why? Why? Because the neshama of a Jew comes from a higher place. Where is that place? Where's the other goat go? Lifnai ulifnim. The one place on earth that is maximally associated with the Shekhinah. This is where the Shekhinah is. Yom Kippur is the time in which you take the neshamos of Klal Yisrael and you bring them back to their source. And in the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, there is no room, there is no place for Aveira. Yom Kippur is the time not of fasting and inui. It's not inui for the sake of self-flagellation. It's inui in the sense that we repress or we ignore better our physical needs. We act like malachim. For one day, that magic day of Yom Kippur, the Rambam doesn't call it a fast, he calls it a shvisa from achila. We go on strike against eating. Eating and drinking become irrelevant. Sometimes our stomachs don't get the message, but we try. It's a day in which we spend the day in the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu like no other day, and that spending of time with that attitude, with that self-definition, with that awareness of who we are, that itself is what cleanses us from Aveira. I always found this morale a key to my own appreciation of Yom Kippur. The time I discovered it, it was always a different Yom Kippur. Let me read to you a few lines that somebody who, a public figure who writes very, very nice stuff. But he wrote the following lines about Rabbi Bar Bar Chana, about all those agados at the beginning of the parak that we're now in Daf Yomi. What should we make of this? We should begin by considering its context, noting that it is part of a series of fantastic fables. These include a man who pursued a demon on horseback, antelope the size of mountains, giant frogs the size of 60 houses that are eaten by even more giant birds, a fish so large it took 3 days to sail between its fins, and scorpions the size of donkeys. You get the idea. Given this context, perhaps the tale of a place where heaven and earth touch as a description of reality should be taken with as much seriousness as the other stories, which is to say, not very seriously at all. I would suggest a better way of phrasing this, rephrasing it, and that would be that all the stories of Chazal, of our sages, should be taken with great seriousness. We should work harder, as the Rambam urged us to do, to uncover the gems that lie within. That happens only when we approach them with the respect due to the masters of our Masorah, of our tradition, using tools like the Maral. Thank you. For more on Maral, if you want, I highly suggest this book. I'm not even sure it's in print anymore. It's the first sefer I ever wrote. It's the Art Scroll Ber Hagola. Ber Hagola is the collection probably of some of the, besides Rabbi Bar Bar Chana, the strangest examples of Agada in Shas. It's called Ber Hagola. Just look in Art Scroll. Okay.
Thank you, Rabbi Adlerstein. I think we're all going to walk away with a new appreciation of the statements of Chazal, and certainly walking a bit closer to Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, just with a bit of a raised awareness of what the day's demand has. But just really a very, very big thank you for Rabbi Adlerstein coming all the way, and certainly didn't hesitate when I approached him to come, and very happy that he agreed to come. Going to Daven Mariv outside for whoever would like to Daven Mariv. Thank you all for coming.